Welcome to Manchester SWP's branch and our meeting on sexism, the police and the system. And our speaker this evening is going to be Amy Leather, who is the joint national organiser of the Socialist Workers' Party.
Well, thanks very much, Celia, and hello to everybody. Well, we have really seen some momentous and shocking events this week, haven't we? As if the horrific murder of Sarah Everard while walking home over Clapham Common, most likely by a serving police officer, as if that wasn't enough, we then witnessed the violent behaviour of the police last Saturday night as they brutally attacked women who'd come to show their respects at a vigil, trampled the flowers and the candles and the tributes, and violently arrested women who had been part of a very peaceful and solemn vigil. And I think it's actually created a bit of a watershed moment, because since then, thousands of people have taken to the streets, not only in London, where I'm based, but in towns and cities around the country. I know there's been hundreds out over a number of nights in Manchester. Although, of course, it's not quite on the same global movement, but it is comparable to the Black Lives Matter movement in some ways. When you have a situation where individual experiences, what many women call everyday sexism, the harassment, you know, in the street, in bars, at work, the catcalls, the comments, the unwanted attention, the violence, and the pervasive dread and fear that you have of that behaviour, when that individual experience has suddenly now had a mass collectivised response on the streets and led to a much wider debate in society. And the mood on the streets has been radical and angry. The anger over Sarah Everard has become entwined with fury over the police response, brutalising women further. And I think it's led to some people concluding that not only are the police institutionally racist, but they're also institutionally sexist. And I'd say it's started to create a bit of a crisis at the top of society. I think it says something about the situation when even Boris Johnson says he was deeply concerned about the footage from Saturday night, when Priti Patel has tried to distance herself. I mean, she was probably on the phone to Cressida Dick, the head of the Metropolitan Police, telling her what to do, but she's now called for an independent review into police behaviour. Even Keir Starmer has said what happened in Clapham was deeply disturbing. And it's very bad timing for the Tories and the establishment. This week saw the second reading in the House of Commons of the new Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill. That would actually give more powers to the police for more Claphams to happen. It's a bill that cracks down on protest. For example, it would become an offence to cause annoyance, which you can define as you want. Restrictions could be imposed on protest if it's too noisy. The bill goes beyond as well. It targets oppressed groups even more, like Roma, Gypsy and Traveller people. You would actually enable the police to stop and search people who've previously been convicted of a knife crime, but without reason or suspicion in new cases. And the bill really says even more about protecting statues than about protecting women and thinking about our safety. So I think a focus of a lot of the protests since Saturday have become not only about challenging sexism that women face, but looking at the police and institutions. You know, the placards I'm sure you saw in Manchester, some of the ones in London, said things like "killed by the system," "kill the bill," ACAB, "defund the police." And there was a nice international one in London. "In Britain, Myanmar and Greece, the oppressor is the police." And I think these have moved the debate on, actually, because last week, when we heard the reports about the murder of Sarah Everard, there was a discussion about individual male violence. Now I think there's a wider discussion about how that violence is generated. Why is it perpetuated even further by institutions like the police that are meant to keep us safe? And what sort of society do we live in that gives rise to such sexist ideas and behaviour towards women? And so in this meeting, I want to try and explore some of those debates about sexism, where it comes from and how we challenge it, and also the role of the police in our society. And look, when it comes to questions of women and sexism, it was quite a week last week. It began with International Women's Day on the Monday, ended with Mother's Day on Sunday, and in between we had the murder and the vigil. It brought a lot of things to the surface, but not a surprise that there is an anger over the level of harassment that women face, because there was a survey out last week that found virtually all young women have faced some form of harassment. 97% of women aged 18 to 24 reported some level of harassment. And not just young women, 80% of all women said they'd experienced harassment. And if you think about it, this comes after the Me Too movement, which erupted just over 3 years ago, after more than 75 women came forward and accused the Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein of sexual harassment and assault. And if you remember, that movement went viral. There was millions of women sharing their stories on social media. Good. You know, it's good to get those stories out there because it actually lifts the mask, even if just for a moment, on oppressive behaviour that often goes unchallenged, as it had with the case of Harvey Weinstein. I always think it's worth noting, though, that often the Hollywood stars are credited with starting the Me Too movement. Actually, it was started originally by a black youth worker called Tarana Burke in a poor neighbourhood in New York back in 2007 as a way of reaching out to poor women and girls who faced abuse. And I think its work she still continues. But the Me Too movement as a whole led to wider revelations about sexual harassment. It engulfed all sections of society, from NGOs, charities, politicians, a range of institutions and organisations. And I think quite rightly led to a discussion about then other aspects of women's oppression as well, about the fight for equal pay that still continues, the battle for abortion rights and far beyond. And I think it showed us that when you look at Britain, of course, a lot has changed in terms of women's lives, but sexism and oppression are alive and kicking. And not only is it a sexual harassment rife, but there was another survey out last week showing that the majority of women are worried that the impact of COVID has pushed us back to the 1970s in terms of gender equality, with women having to take up the brunt of extra work in the home, women more likely to be furloughed, more likely to lose their jobs, and had to carry that burden of homeschooling, domestic chores during the pandemic. And then we have the question of violence against women, because we had the very ironic situation on Saturday of the police in their official report to women before the vigil to stay at home for their own safety. The home is in fact one of the most dangerous places for women to be. This is actually where most violence against women occurs. People are probably familiar in this meeting with that shocking statistic that 2 women a week in Britain are killed due to domestic violence from their current or former partners. And we shouldn't just spout it out, we should be shocked by that. And it's got worse during the lockdowns as women can't escape from those situations. I read a report how in 1 week in January, 3 women in Liverpool, just in Liverpool, were murdered. And of course, when we talk about violence, I think we also have to acknowledge that some groups of women face even more violence in society as a whole. Muslim women, as Islamophobia is stoked, and also trans women as well. So there is a lot to challenge and fight for, and it is right for us to be angry on the streets. But I think as part of this, we have to look at where this behaviour comes from, because our analysis about where sexism and women's oppression comes from is going to influence our strategy about how we fight against it. And I think as socialists, we have to look at wider society, because I don't think baby boys are born with sexist ideas in their heads. I don't think they're born ready to be an aggressor or with a predisposition to harass women or be violent towards them. I think they are shaped by the society they grew up in and are socialised into it. And I think therefore we have to look at that society and how women's oppression is structured into capitalism. Now, of course, oppression plays out in often a very individualised way. You know, we as women experience sexism as individuals, often from individual men. And we have to challenge that at every level because there's no excuse for harassment, violence or sexist behaviour. But the sexism doesn't just come from those individuals and out of their heads, because there are deeper structures at work which shape men and women's behaviour and expectations towards one another. And I would argue that inequality and oppression are rooted in the economic structure of society, and this then gives rise to all the ideas about women in that society, and that how the drive for profit and commodification at the heart of capitalism distorts all our relationships. And I always think in these discussions it is worth just saying women's oppression has not always existed. For 90% of the time modern humans are on Earth, we lived in very different societies, hunter-gatherer societies with no hierarchy or systematic women's oppression. And I say that because actually it means you can have a society without women's oppression in the future, but also because something happened that created that. It wasn't just natural to humans. And I would argue it's entwined with the growth of class society and takes a particular form under capitalism. Capitalism, where the majority of us, women and men actually, are exploited at work, while a tiny minority, the rich and powerful, own everything and control it. And the key power relations in society flow from this. And I would say capitalism thrives on sexism, because partly like all forms of oppression, divide and rule is very useful. It's quite helpful for men and women to be blaming each other rather than those at the top. But very crucially, because capitalism needs the unpaid labour of women in the family to be able to function. Despite the very big changes in our lives, it is still women's assumed primary role to be the primary caregiver, the child rearers, carers for other family members, and doing it all for free. It's worth something like, even before COVID, $3 trillion annually. Now, this isn't just something that happens because individual men sit back in the family and let the women do the work. Actually, this is something structured into society, backed up by policies, ideology, and financial incentives. As I say, it's structured in. Even if you just look at the question of childcare, paid paternity leave, 2 weeks. So the fact that there is a pay gap and women earn far less, women stay at home. That's the economic pressure. The man goes back to work, woman has to stay at home with a new baby. Maternity pay is very low. Often new dads actually work the longest hours. Women become the expert child carer. They're at home more, they take on more housework, and there's a lot of ideological pressure to be wonderful at all those things, and that's how you're going to, get gratification, feel good in life and everything that comes from the media and everywhere else. So you see as well then how the individual family unit and women's role is very beneficial to capitalism, doing all that work to enable it to function, bringing up the children, all that work. But you also then see how this individual family unit is expected to take all the strain of all the problems in society, of unemployment if someone loses their job, of having low or poverty pay, of not having access to childcare. How do you juggle it around your shifts or whatever else you've got to do? Bad housing, overcrowded housing, damp, ill family members. All those things impact and are meant to be dealt with by that individual family unit within the confines of your home. It becomes like a pressure cooker and can explode. And I think it begins to explain why there is such a prevalence of more violence against women in the home and by someone they know. And I think then the fact that women have lower pay and they are being made responsible for children with a lack of access to support means they get trapped often in these dangerous and violent situations. And all those cuts that we've seen to welfare services and nursery provision or whatever it is impact women even more, because it piles a responsibility back onto every individual woman in the home and puts more pressure on that family unit. And the point here is, even if some of us don't live in stereotypical families, lots of us don't, even if we do share the caring and the housework with our partners, this is such a powerful ideology. It shapes our experience. It's the ideal that's held up and normalised across society. And so much else is built around it. And so I think you can see both how violence towards women takes place in the family, as I say, in the home, but it also, that role of women in the family begins to explain why the sexual behaviour and harassment. Because from women's role in the family becomes all the ideas about what a woman should be: caring, nurturing, friendly, willing to please everybody, always available, sexually desirable and fertile because your primary role is to have children. And so sexist ideas begin to develop, not just in a vacuum or out of men's heads, but very much as a consequence of how society is organised and women's role within it. This then begins to offer us a material basis of understanding women's oppression. And sexual harassment is very much a symptom of women's oppression. Because if you think about it, women, their primary goal is to be attractive, have children, care for everyone, make everyone feel better, comfort them. This expectation actually helps to explain some of the sexism people face. You think about women on the call, I'm sure there's comments from, not just comments you get from strangers like, oh, smile, or you're not making the best of yourself, love. It comes from these expectations about how women are seen in society, really, and the objectification as well that comes with that. And that brings me really to the question of commodification as well, because as we know, capitalism is a system driven by profit and ruthless desire to make more profits for those at the top. And they are happy to make money out of every aspect of our lives, from how we look to our emotions. And they're definitely happy to do that with women's lives, particularly our bodies. Whether it's the right clothes and makeup to the right body shape, all can be fixed by money. A plastic surgery has invaded just about every aspect of body shape, from whether it's nose and breast enlargements. You can now shape your feet to fit certain shoes. You can redesign your vagina. But also the whole last decade or more, you see the rise of a sort of raunch culture, new sexism, where those old-fashioned sexist ideas are sold back to us as being empowering. The normalisation of lap dancing, pole dancing, the sexualisation of club nights. Actually, if you think about club nights at universities, actually it's a place where harassment is rife. And you've seen this perpetuated sometimes at some of the top universities through how their club nights are portrayed, their sports societies. And you see how this drive for money and profit to every aspect of society distorts all our relationships, but particularly how women are seen and objectified. And we live in this highly sexualised society. Sex is commodified at every level. Women are objectified, from the media to adverts to whatever it is. But this also has very dehumanising aspects. And part of it is women are encouraged to be seen as sexually available and attractive, but then every effort is made to blame victims of any crimes. And it shows how much women's bodies are still battlegrounds, and you can't win on any level. Even if, you know, you dress, I don't know, in a scantily way, well, then you provoked it, you asked for it. But I don't know if you just saw the other side to it. This week, a 12-year-old Muslim schoolgirl was threatened with legal action by her school because her skirt was too long. Switzerland, last week, the week of International Women's Day, banned women from being able to choose to wear the niqab or the burqa. So you see how women's bodies are fought over at every level and cannot win. And victims are blamed in this, which I think leads us to the question of the police, actually, because I think we know actually how the police blame victims. Even on Saturday night after the vigil, a woman walking home was flashed at. The police dismissed it and said, well, we've had enough tonight. But if you look at the statistics, over the last 5 years, the number of rapes reported to the police rose to 60,000. But the proportion that made it to court is now at an all-time low. This is an effective decriminalisation of rape in that way. You could look at other things like, you know, if you think about back to the very horrific cases of child sexual abuse and grooming gangs, centred on places like Rotherham, Rochdale, other areas in the media, and actually very subject to a racist narrative, when you looked at grooming gangs in the totality, majority were white men. But what was the really big story that was ignored? That the police had not believed the stories of abuse from very vulnerable young women who had been groomed. And I think, therefore, just these stories alone begin to make clear that the police, who we're told are meant to protect us and keep us safe, in many cases don't. Actually, I'd go further. Their role isn't even meant to be to protect us. Not to protect us, the majority. Their job is to protect the tiny minority at the top of society, the wealthy and the powerful. The police are actually there to protect their property, to protect, if you like, the business as usual of profit-making of capitalism. I mean, you know, the police haven't even always existed. They developed actually with the rise of capitalism and the growth of a new working class, bringing together in workplaces to try and prevent resistance to the capitalists at the top. And so their job is very much to uphold a system that, like I say, has sexism and women's oppression at its heart, as well as racism and many other backward and terrible ideas. And I think this is why actually the police are racist and sexist to the core. And often the police have far worse attitudes than the general population, partly because they're separated off, actually they're paid more than most workers, they are socialised in a way that reinforces their stereotypes of people and sections of people that they're going to treat with suspicion and contempt. And this is really what we mean by being institutionally racist and sexist. It's not just a few bad apples, a few police that have the wrong ideas. The ideas actually flow from the top of the police force and gives rise to a sort of canteen culture that, to be honest, would be challenged in other organisations and workplaces. I don't know if people saw the Guardian article this week, which kind of exposed some of this canteen culture and the absolute appalling language regularly used to refer to women, which I'm not going to repeat in this meeting, with a woman police officer saying it was a question of toxic masculinity, absolutely terrible behaviour, attitudes that flow into their own behaviour, not only not believing victims, but the police's own behaviour. Again, in 2019, it was found that in the 6 years before, there'd been 1,500 accusations of sexual misconduct made against the police. And they included things like police officers coercing vulnerable rape victims into sexual relationships with them. Many of these complaints were upheld. Nearly 200 officers were sacked or resigned. I think it shows that with this attitude, this behaviour, it's not a surprise that victims of domestic violence are often ignored, and actually why black people are disproportionately likely as well to die in police custody. These ideas, sexist culture, but racist ideas as well, flow from, you know, the system of capitalism that generates and perpetuates women's oppression and racism and other things as well. And I haven't got time to go through about the police's role, but I would urge people to read a very good new article on the Socialist Worker website. We've got a long reads bit by Judy Cox on the history of police violence against women and why it shows cops can't be reformed. Because actually, like I say, it talks about the whole history of the police. And particularly what they can't stand is when women are then also part of a resistance in society. And she goes back to 1819 and St Peter's Fields massacre in Manchester to show obviously that was a fight by men and women together for their rights, but how police really targeted women in a certain way, as they did with the suffragettes movement and beyond. So look, for my final bit, what are the solutions here then to sexism, violence towards women, harassment and the police? Well, I want to say from the start, the solution is not more women at the top. It's not having more women at the top of the police force. Someone actually said that Cressida Dick, this was a spokesperson from the Reclaim These Streets, said Cressida Dick shouldn't go because it would set back gender equality. So somehow we're meant to feel better that a woman at the head of the police that just brutally attacked women was a woman. I think it shows instead actually all women don't have the same interests, and we don't have the same interest in challenging the system. I'm sure Cressida Dick has experienced sexism and actually homophobia as well in the police. But she's part of an organisation that defends this sexist and racist system. She's not part of the solution. And to be honest, there were calls for her to resign. I think she should resign. I'm not worried, some people say we should be worried her successor might be even worse. I'll tell you what though, if she was driven out, her successor would know she'd been driven out, and that would be a victory for our side. And I think it points to why it's very important to protest and act collectively. I don't know if people knew that the Labour Party was going to vote for that police bill, and because of the consequence of the protests, they changed and voted against. Protests do matter. I also think we have to be clear, the solution for women's safety is not more law and order and not more police. That was one of the solutions last week actually, more police, that will make women safer. They're not going to protect us. You probably saw the idea being mooted this week that they're going to deploy more undercover cops in bars to protect women. I think that idea probably fills most of us with horror, given the history of undercover policing, who had relationships with women based on lies, which essentially meant they were in sexual relationships without consent. Instead, I think collectivising our response is very important at every level. And I think we have to be clear. When we talk about collectivising our response, I think working class men are part of that as well. Working class men are also actually harassed by the police. If you're a black working class man, it's a very dangerous point when you're taken by the police. And police are used against all working class people when they resist on pickets, strikes and demonstrations. And the point here, you see, is class is about exploitation, but it's also a potential source of power. The ruling class, the minority at the top, created the police on purpose because they knew working class people were the majority and did all the work in society and potentially could sweep them from power. That's why they created the police force, to try and protect themselves. And I think we have to be clear, and I think it's been very clear in the last week, women are not victims. And it's not like we have to go and ask people, working class men, for support. Women are part of the working class. And this is actually one of the strongest places to fight oppression, collectively, both on the streets, but also when we're brought together in workplaces and unions. In the aftermath of the Me Too movement, the TUC, the trade unions, looked at harassment in the workplace. It found women were much more likely to face harassment when they were working in insecure, precarious work, individualised work, where there wasn't a trade union. Actually, it wasn't just sexual harassment. Everything in those workplaces was worse. In bullying, it was about how do we respond to that. The question of the universities is a big question about what do we do as well. A Guardian article found levels of harassment there at epidemic levels, at every level. I think we have to fight collectively about how cultures are changed in the Students' Union, that sexist images are challenging, where actually there's fights over lighting and proper safety, not more police patrolling under the cover of COVID as they have been in Manchester. And I think when it comes to violence against women, we also have to challenge the austerity and cuts that has put women in even more dangerous spaces. The cuts to refuges, to women's support agencies, to childcare, to creches, to after school clubs and all that. That's part of a collective fight for our class, for the welfare state and more. And I think we should be clear, change comes through struggle. All the gains we've made, the right to vote, abortion rights, equal pay in law at least, because people fought. And I know we're discussing International Women's Day, last week, actually that put the question of the struggle of women workers at the forefront. It was originally called International Working Women's Day, as women were fighting against the oppression they faced as women and exploitation at work. And I think all this shows we have to fight now to make for safer spaces, as I've talked about, against the cuts that push it onto women, etc. But we're also clear, every gain we make, capitalism tries to roll back. As we can see, they try and take back the things that we want and make it worse. It's also true that I think we're clear that I don't think we can reform the police. We have to both then dismantle the police entirely, and also, if we think that sexism is part and parcel of capitalism, I think the conclusion is to get rid of the whole system. And that's why we have to talk about revolutionary change. This is my final bit, Chair. Revolutionary change as a mass collective act that gets rid of exploitation, abolishes class, but also uproots women's oppression completely. And I don't think that's a pipe dream. We can talk and maybe discuss the immense class struggles and revolutionary situations and revolutions where women have been at the heart to fighting to collectively transform society with a vision of liberation that goes far beyond the gains you can just make under capitalism, a complete challenge to society and how relations are, to create actually a much safer society, but a society in which we can all flourish.